while Seed of Abraham Torah class was founded on the need to study the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, it's also is probably the most profitable for us when we can understand the relevance the Torah has for believers in our day and age, and then we apply it to our lives. It is said by many preachers and teachers that we today are in a very special time in history. We are eyewitnesses to the age-old Bible prophecies coming to pass, and they're right. But to put that into perspective, it is good to realize that not every generation has witnessed prophetic events coming to pass. So one would think that when a prophecy of God did come to fruition, God's people would get all excited about it. Yet the church and the synagogue, the earth's secular Jewish population, has for the most part greeted 2 of the most important events in all of prophetic history, the rebirth of Israel as a Jewish nation and the return of the control of Jerusalem to the Jewish people, sometimes with a disinterested yawn. I think it's primarily because, first, we don't know the Bible well enough to know biblical prophecy, let alone see it when it happens. And second, even if we do somewhat know the Bible, we don't realize that fulfillments of prophecy don't happen every day or even every century. In fact, with the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, for all practical purposes, the unfolding of biblically prophesied events went into hibernation for an extended period of time. For better than 18 centuries, not a single prophetic event that is outlined in the Bible came to pass. Oh, there was a lot going on in the world in preparation for the day that God would once again start the prophetic clock ticking, counting down to the end of all things as we know them. For almost 1,900 years, God's people had nothing from which to gauge just where in Bible history we stand. That's not the case for us living today. However, to look around us, you'd think nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Just within this past week, in June of 2015, 2 civilization-changing events happened that we're going to look back upon in a few years, maybe in just a few more months, and perhaps then we'll grasp their enormity. First, the leader of the largest segment of Christ's church on planet Earth, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, openly and formally sided with Israel's archenemy, the Palestinians, and therefore equally as formally sided against Israel. Second, one of the last bastions of Christianity in the West, the United States of America formally declared gay marriage to be the law of the land. There can be no more appeal. Nothing could be a greater affront to God the Creator than what has just happened, all taking place literally in a matter of hours. All I can say is pray and prepare. Well, after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the next prophesied event that was to occur was the return of those who had been dispersed and exiled from what is called the Roman Dispersion, or Roman exile. The Jewish people, believers and non-believers, kept their bags packed and waited expectantly for that return from exile, probably for just a few decades following the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, because they were outlawed from that city. But the return didn't happen. The Gentile church and the Messianic Jews of the 2nd century AD thought certainly Christ was going to return at any moment. Paul certainly thought that. And likewise, the traditional Jews thought that the return to their homeland, rebuilding of their temple, well, it was imminent. Didn't happen. Those worshiping the God of Israel and living in the 3rd century, well, they were getting restless, getting pretty worried about what was taking so long for God to call his people back to the Holy Land. But their worries weren't put to rest. In the 4th century, the thoroughly Gentilized Church of Jesus Christ was still awaiting his return. The Jews of every nation to which they had emigrated wondered if maybe the time was finally near when they could go back home, as did those of the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th centuries, right on up to about the 17th century, when Christianity took a fateful turn, and many in the Christian institutional leadership came to the conclusion we must have been misreading those biblical prophecies about the return of Israel to their homeland all along. Much of the church concluded that Israel wasn't going to return. At the least, there wasn't going to be a Jewish Israel, and that the Israel the Bible spoke of, both the people and the land, were symbolic of something else. But what? They decided it had to be of the Gentile church. The new mainstream beliefs that arose and which today dominate the Christian landscape began mostly in the 17th century. And those beliefs centered on the newly held conviction that Israel had been replaced by the church. It was given the fancy theological name supersessionism, or as lay people are more familiar with, replacement theology. This new doctrine held that Israel had been thoroughly and permanently rejected by Jehovah because so many Jews had rejected God's Son, and that all the promises of land and of redemption that the Hebrews had received through the covenants of Abraham and Moses, this was taken away from them. It was handed over to the Gentile church. That is, the Gentile church would now get all the blessings promised to Abraham, those promises that we read about in the first few verses of Genesis chapter 12. But Israel, on the other hand, well, they were going to get all the curses that would come from disobedience to the laws of Moses. Well, now let's fast forward to the 20th century. Uh-oh. In the famous words of Apollo 13, Houston, we have a problem. Because in 1948, Israel did surprise the world and returned to the exact location to which they were exiled. The Jewish nation was reborn, just as prophesied. And in 1967, the holy city of Jerusalem was returned to the control of the Jewish people, just as predicted, therefore ordained by Messiah. And what's been the church's general reaction to these staggering events? Oh, for few, some excitement. For the majority, ambivalence. The same replacement theological positions born from the lack of faith in God's word by 17th century church leaders, positions completely now intertwined and embedded within modern Christian doctrine, is to this day what's still being taught in the overwhelming majority of churches worldwide. It's as though the rebirth of national Israel and the return of their Jews to their homeland to claim their promises made to Abraham never happened. Christians have been taught from early childhood to express disappointment and shake our heads knowingly, those terrible Jews of Yeshua's day that had the unimaginable privilege of witnessing the arrival of the long-awaited Messiah, but were then blinded to who he was by their Jewish leaders and traditions. So blind that they encouraged the killing of the Son of God for claiming who he really was. Well, today, we of the church have witnessed that long-awaited day when Israel would be returned from their exile, reclaim their land inheritance, and reborn as a nation. We've watched on TV as the Israeli army defeated an alliance of 5 powerful Arab armies in a matter of only 6 days, and then in 1967 reclaimed Jerusalem as their own holy city for the first time since 70 AD. The prophecy has been fulfilled in our generation. The Jews are back, and for the most part, due to our Christian traditions, the church has been utterly blind to its significance. Interestingly, it was a little under 1,900 years from the time God made his promises to Abraham until Messiah arrived. And it was a little under 1,900 years from the day God kicked his people out of the land, but promised he'd bring them back, until the day they came back to claim that promise once and for all. Maybe we ought to take notice of that. Maybe we ought to understand that enormous changes are on the way very soon. There are many mentions scattered throughout the Bible of these events, but for me, none has the impact of those spoken by that strange prophet of God, Ezekiel. Ezekiel was one of those Jews taken from his home in Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, exiled to Babylon, when the Babylonian Empire conquered Judah in 597 BC. So let's detour just a little bit, and at the same time connect some dots between the promises made to Abraham in Genesis 12 and 13 and Ezekiel's prophetic utterances of Ezekiel 36 and 37, and then how that connects to the events of our time by reading the prophetic story of the final return, of the final exile of the Jewish people to their homeland. A return that, after an 18th-century hiatus of prophetic fulfillments, marks the resumption of the countdown to Armageddon and then the entry into the millennial kingdom of God. So open your Bibles to Ezekiel chapters 36 and 37. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, we're starting on page 689. We're going to start with Ezekiel 36 and read straight through to the end of chapter 37. Now you, human being, prophesy to the mountains of Israel, say, mountains of Israel, hear the message from Adonai. Adonai Elohim says, the enemy's boasting over you. Ha! Even the ancient high places are ours now. Therefore prophesy. Say that Adonai Elohim says, because they desolated you and they swallowed you up from every side so that the other nations could take possession of you. And now people are gossiping about you, slandering you. Therefore, mountains of Israel, hear the message of Adonai Elohim. This is what Adonai Elohim says to the mountains and the hills, to the streams, the valleys, the desolate wastes, the abandoned cities, now preyed on and derided by the other surrounding nations. Therefore, this is what Adonai Elohim says. In the heat of my jealousy, I speak against the other nations and all of Edom. Since rejoicing with all their heart, they have arrogated my land to themselves as a possession, and with utter contempt seized it as prey. Therefore prophesy concerning the land of Israel, and say this to the mountains, to the hills, the streams, and the valleys, that Adonai Elohim says this. I speak in my jealousy and fury, because you have endured being shamed by the nations. Therefore says Adonai Elohim, I have raised my hand and I have sworn the nations surrounding you will bear their shame. But you, mountains of Israel, you will sprout your branches. You'll bear fruit for my people Israel, who will soon return. I am here for you. I will turn toward you. Then you will be tilled and sown. I will multiply your population. All the house of Israel, all of it. The cities will be inhabited. The ruins will be rebuilt. I will multiply both the human and animal populations. They'll increase and be productive. I will cause you to be inhabited as you were before. Indeed, I will do you more good than before. You will know that I'm Adonai. I'll cause people to walk on you, my people Israel. They will possess you. You will be their inheritance. Never again will you make them childless. Adonai Elohim says, because they say to you, land, you devour people and make your nations childless, therefore you will no longer devour people and you will not make your nations childless anymore, says Adonai Elohim. I will not permit the nations to shame you or the peoples to reproach you any longer, and you will no more cause your nations to stumble, says Adonai Elohim. The word of Adonai came to me. Human being, when the house of Israel lived in their own land, they defiled it by the manner of their lives and their actions. Their way before me was like the uncleanness of Nidah. Therefore I poured out my fury on them because of the blood they had shed in the land, because they defiled it with their idols. I scattered them among the nations. I dispersed them throughout the countries. I judged them in keeping with the manner of life and actions. And when they came to the nations they were going to, they profaned my holy name, so that the people said of them, these are Adonai's people who have been exiled from his land. But I'm concerned about my holy name, which the house of Israel is profaning among the nations where they've gone. Therefore tell the house of Israel that Adonai Elohim says this, I'm not going to do this for your sake, house of Israel, but for the sake of my holy name, which you've been profaning among the nations where you went. I will set apart my great name to be regarded as holy, since it's been profaned in the nations. You profaned it among them. The nations will know that I'm Adonai, says Adonai Elohim, when before their eyes I am set apart through you to be regarded as holy. For I'll take you from among the nations, gather you from all the countries, and return you to your own soil. There I will sprinkle clean water on you. You'll be clean. I will cleanse you from all your uncleanness, from all your idols. I'll give you a new heart. I'll put a new spirit inside of you. I'll take that stony heart of flesh out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I'll put my spirit inside you, cause you to live by my laws, respect my rulings and obey them. You will live in the land I gave to your ancestors. You will be my people. I will be your God. I will save you from all your uncleanness. I will summon the grain and increase it, not send famine against you. I will multiply the yield of fruit from the trees and increase production in the fields, so that you never again suffer the reproach of famine among the nations. Then you will remember your evil ways and your actions that were not good. And as you look at yourselves, you will loathe yourselves for your guilt, for your disgusting practices. Understand, says Adonai Elohim, I'm not doing this for your sake. Instead, be ashamed. Be dismayed by your ways, house of Israel. Adonai Elohim says, when that day comes for me to cleanse you from all your guilt, I'll cause the cities to be inhabited and the ruins to be rebuilt. The land that was desolate will be tilled, whereas formerly it lay desolate for all passing by to see. And then they'll say, the land that used to be desolate has become like Gan Eden. And the cities formerly ruined and abandoned and wasted have been fortified and are inhabited. Then the nations around you that remain will know that I, Adonai, have rebuilt the ruins and replanted what I have abandoned. I, Adonai, have spoken. I will do it. Adonai Elohim says, in addition, I will let the house of Israel pray to me to do this for them, to increase their numbers like sheep, like flocks of sheep for sacrifices, like the flocks of sheep in Jerusalem at its designated times. In this degree will the ruined cities be filled with flocks of people. Then they will know that I'm Adonai. Chapter 37. With the hand of Adonai upon me, Adonai carried me out by his spirit and set me down in the middle of the valley, and it was full of bones. And he had me pass by all around them. There were so many bones lying in the valley. They were so dry. And he asked me, human being, can these bones live? And I answered, Adonai Elohim, only you know that. And then he said to me, prophesy over these bones, and say to them, dry bones, hear what Adonai has to say. To these bones, Adonai Elohim says, I will make breath enter you, and you will live. I will attach ligaments to you, make flesh grow on you, cover you with skin, put breath in you. You will live. You will know that I'm Adonai. So I prophesied as ordered. And while I was prophesying, there was a noise, rattling sound. It was the bones coming together, each bone in its proper place. And as I watched, ligaments grew on them, flesh appeared, skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. And next he said to me, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, human being, say to the breath that Adonai Elohim says, come from the four winds, breathe. Breathe on these slain so they can live. So I prophesied as ordered. The breath came into them. They were alive. And they stood up on their feet, a huge army. And then he said to me, human being, these bones are the whole house of Israel. And they are saying, our bones have dried up. Our hope is gone. We're completely cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them what Adonai Elohim says, my people, I will open up your graves and make you get up out of your graves. I'll bring you into the land of Israel. Then you'll know that I am Adonai when I have opened up your graves and made you get out of your graves, my people. I will put my spirit in you. You will be alive. Then I will place you in your own land, and you will know that I, Adonai, have spoken, and that I have done it, says Adonai. The word of Adonai came to me. You, human being, take one stick and write on it, for Judah, for those joined with him among the people of Israel. Next, take another stick and write on it, for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel who are joined with him. Now finally, bring them together into a single stick so they become one in your hand. And when your people ask you what all of this means, tell them that Adonai Elohim says this, I'll take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, together with the tribes of Israel who are joined with him, put them together with the stick of Judah and make them a single stick so they'll become one in my hand. And the sticks on which you write are to be in your hand as they watch. And then say to them that Adonai Elohim says, I will take the people of Israel from among the nations where they've gone and gather them from every side and bring them back to their own land. I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. And one king will be king for all of them. They will no longer be two nations. They will never again be divided into two kingdoms. They will never again defile themselves with their idols, their detestable things, or any of their transgressions, but I will save them from all the places where they've been living and sinning. I will cleanse them so that they will be my people. I will be their God. My servant David will be king over them. All of them will have one shepherd. They'll live by my rulings and keep and observe my regulations. They will live in the land I gave to Jacob my servant, where your ancestors lived. They will live there. They, their children, and their grandchildren forever. And David, my servant, will be their leader forever. I'll make a covenant of peace with them, an everlasting covenant. I will give to them and increase their numbers and set my sanctuary among them forever. My home will be with them. I will be their God. They will be my people. The nations will know that I am Adonai, who sets Israel apart as holy, when my sanctuary is with them forever. Wow. I wish George Lucas or Steven Spielberg would make a movie about that. The first point I want to make is that this event talked about in Ezekiel is not about the return of the Jews from Babylon. And since the study of these two chapters of Ezekiel could be a couple of weeks in itself, I'm just going to point out a couple of important keys to understanding these verses. First and foremost is the important meaning of the term, the whole house of Israel, also at times translated as both houses of Israel, or even just all Israel. Now, the words of Ezekiel were written over a span of about 25 years, beginning around the time Babylon conquered Judah in 597 BC. The part we're looking at was written in the later years. You need to know that about 130 years earlier, the Hebrews were a divided nation. A 10-tribe confederacy lived in the northern area of the Holy Lands, while a 2-tribe group lived in the south. In fact, the northern area was a kingdom all its own, separate, apart from the southern area, each ruled by its own kings. I want to be very clear. The unified kingdom of Israel existed for only 80 years. That's all. And it was ruled over by David and then Solomon. Then it became divided by means of a civil war. After the division, the northern area went by several different names. The northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. Some documents even refer to it as the kingdom of Joseph. But for the most part, as was typical for that era, it was called after the name of the tribe that was dominant in the region. Just as it's acknowledged here in Ezekiel, the tribe of Ephraim. From about 900 BC to the time of Ezekiel, about 590 BC, the northern region was known to its inhabitants as the kingdom of Ephraim, a name that most believers aren't familiar with. Ephraim, son of Joseph, was a grandson of Jacob. Ephraim was adopted away from his father Joseph by Jacob. Then Ephraim was given a great prophetic blessing. The southern kingdom, however, is more familiar to us. It's called Judah. In Bible speak, the northern kingdom was also called the house of Israel or the house of Ephraim. The southern kingdom called the house of Judah. These two houses, the house of Ephraim, the house of Judah, together make up what the Bible calls the whole house of Israel. Yet almost all Bibles will, instead of saying house of Ephraim, say house of Israel, which is confusing. Indeed, house of Israel was a term used for a few years immediately following the Civil War to denote the northern kingdom, but that name quickly fell out of use. The point is that until in the just last decade or so, only one of the two houses of Israel has returned to their homeland, Judah. Judah is made up of what we today call Jews. That other house of Israel, the one that's comprised of 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, was not recognized by modern Israel for who they are, and they were generally prohibited from coming home. All that has changed, and the remnants of the 10 lost tribes are returning in ever-increasing flow, and an ever-increasing flow as I speak. And I've personally witnessed some of the new arrivals as they arrived at Ben Gurion Airport. The part of Ezekiel 37 where he's talking about the two sticks, one for Ephraim, one for Judah, being put back together is referring to the time when both of the houses of Israel will return to the Holy Lands and be reunited. But until very recently, only one house, the house of Judah, the Jews, had come back. The common question is, well, isn't Ezekiel really about the return of the Jews from their Babylonian exile? No. No, it's not. Because that exile was only the exile of Judah. The other house of Israel, Ephraim, had long ago been conquered by Assyria. The people were deported. They were scattered throughout the 120 nations that formed the Assyrian Empire. That event happened almost 1.5 centuries earlier than Ezekiel's time, and basically, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom had ceased to exist as an identifiable people. In other words, the events spoken about in Ezekiel 36 and 37 could not have been about the return from Babylon, but it had to come later. Yet the return of Ephraim is happening right now. In March of 2005, the Israeli government officially sanctioned the return to the Holy Lands of people who say They're not Jews, but they are Israel. That is, these Hebrew people seeking to immigrate to Israel are some of those long-lost 10 tribes of Israel, the other house of Israel, Ephraim. Once more, if we're to understand prophecy and the events of our times in their proper perspective, we must also grasp that the Jews are only of the tribe or kingdom of Judah, at least speaking of heredity, which basically represents just 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah. Ephraim represents the other 10 tribes, the long assumed to be lost and unidentifiable, and they're not Jews, although some of them have converted to Judaism. But they are certainly Israelites, and they are Hebrews. So the events that we just read about in Ezekiel 36 and 32 are invisible process today. If so, why doesn't the church pay any attention to this? Today, the church is in the throes of a rather severe internal debate over the land that the Jews have returned to, Israel, and in which Ephraim is also now coming back. It is the consequences of that argument that is going to someday throw the entire world into a final war, which is what the following chapters of Ezekiel would take us into if we were to keep on reading. Now, some believers may want to argue as to the precise boundaries of the land that God gave to Abraham for all time, but please hear me. At the very least, it includes every inch of the land that Israel has today and the land that the Palestinians claim is theirs. You see, the area in which Abraham stood at the moment God made him that promise and said to Abraham, "This is the land, Abraham, I'm giving to you and your descendants," is right in the heart, guess where? Of the West Bank. Or in the most ridiculous possible term, the occupied territory. That drives me nuts. It's occupied, not occupied by the people that ought to have it, the Jews. I cannot begin to tell you the downright sense of dread I have for America every time I hear our president or our secretary of state talk about severing the West Bank from the possession of Israel through tremendous political pressure, and then giving that land to the Palestinians as their sovereign nation. What do you think the two-state solution is all about? We even have a large coalition of churches demanding the very same thing, born out of a doctrine of love, tolerance, fairness, and mercy for the Arabs and for the Palestinians. Just this past week, the United Church of Christ voted to boycott and sanction Israel and to stand with the Palestinians. Be aware. This land in question is precisely the land God gave to Abraham and set aside for his descendants for all time. God has warned those that come against Abraham's descendants, those that curse Abraham, God himself will come against, and he will judge them in wrath. In other words, they will be cursed in return. Every indication biblically is that indeed somebody is going to force upon Israel the decision to surrender a portion of that land that is at the center of the Abrahamic covenant, the very place Abraham was standing when God said, "This is yours." At the moment, sadly, it looks like it's going to be the United States government who will enforce the so-called two-state solution. And the peace that the world longs for in our time is going to happen for a very brief time. But the problem is that peace with the world automatically means war with God. You see, God's pattern of dividing, separating, and electing has never ended. In the 21st century, we are living in one of those defining and dividing moments of this God principle. And part of that dividing and separating process God is bringing about is a response to one single question. Where do you stand on Israel? Where do you stand on Israel? That's the question for our age. And like it or not, we have to choose one side or the other. We can choose to obey God and honor His covenants and have peace with Him. Or we can stand with the world. The Roman Catholic Church has just chosen to stand with the world against Israel. Standing with Israel is standing with God. Not standing with Israel's enemies is standing with the world, therefore against God. The die has been cast. It's done. It happened in June of 2015. Mark this on your calendars. Well, let's finish up chapter 13 of Genesis now by rereading verses 14 through 18. So turn your Bible to Genesis chapter 13, please. Genesis chapter 13. And we're just going to read a few verses. It's on page 12 if you have a complete Jewish Bible, verses 14 through 18. Adonai said to Avram, after Lot had moved away from him, "Look all around you from where you are, to the north, to the south, the east, and the west. All the land you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as numerous as the specks of dust on the earth, so that if a person can count the specks of dust on the earth, then your descendants can be counted. Get up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, because I will give it to you." Avram moved his tent, and he came to live by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. There he built an altar to Adonai. Well, now that I've demonstrated to you that the words of these verses are still in effect and will be until the end of the age, I really hope you can see the importance of them. The land God showed Abraham is to be unconditionally Israel's forever. Where exactly was Abram when he stood looking around in every compass direction and all that he saw was to belong to him and his descendants? The Genesis Apocryphon places him precisely at Ramoth Hatzor. Ramoth means high place, which is about 5 miles northeast of Bethel. It is the highest spot in central Israel with an altitude of almost 3,300 feet. From this spot, even today, you can see the Mediterranean Sea to the west, eastward well into the modern-day city, or modern-day kingdom, rather, of Jordan. You can see a long way from up there. I can only imagine how clear it was back then. Verse 17 goes on to say, Abraham was to walk the length and the breadth of the land because God gave it to him. What does that mean exactly? Walk the length and breadth of the land. Was he just literally to stop what he was doing and go on a trip to visit every area of the land? Is that what that meant? Or was this just symbolic of something? Maybe it's just a Hebrew idiom. The Targum Jonathan, which is an early Hebrew commentary, says that what was happening was that Abraham was doing chazakah. Chazakah. Chazakah was a widespread legal custom of that era. It was established well before this time. It was used throughout the various tribes and peoples of the Middle East. It was known by the Egyptians. It was known by the Hittites. And it's attested to in their ancient records, which we have. The concept was, when a piece of property is acquired, the new owner is to walk the perimeter of the entire property. This was symbolic, if you would, of marking his territory. Not until the new owner had done this was the transfer complete and the boundaries officially established. He had to walk the perimeter of the land. Some cultures even required the king or the ruler to walk the perimeter of his kingdom from time to time to reestablish his sovereignty over that territory. Why would God make Abraham do this? I surmise it was for Abraham's sake, and for the sake of the many who likely asked, why are you doing chazakah? I have no doubt that Abraham did not make friends as a result of this well-recognized procedure, because within the outline of the territory he marked with his steps were many already established kingdoms and city-states. And I suspect they weren't too pleased by this foreigner's symbolic declaration he was taking ownership of all this land. But there's another reason to do this as well. We're going to see all throughout the Torah, the remainder of the Old Testament and the entire Bible in general, that when human governmental systems existed, God tends to allow people involved to use the laws and ordinances and customs of their system when land transactions and contracts happen. Abraham would have been completely familiar with the reason the Lord was telling him to go and walk the land, because that's how things were done. In fact, it probably would have been very disquieting, leaving much in doubt for Abraham, if God hadn't ordered that to happen. It would have been as though we went in to buy a car. We filled out all the paperwork, we laid a check on the table, and the dealer says, no need for you or I to sign anything. Just take the car and go. We'll just take each other's word for it. We would feel pretty uncomfortable with doing something like that, because it's just not customary in our society. Normally, all parties sign paperwork to make the transaction legal. Signing the paperwork finishes the process of transferring the ownership of the car from the dealer to you. Same thing here with Abraham. By every legal custom of that day, walking the perimeter of the land legally identified the land in question, and it completed the transfer of the property, thereby leaving both parties with a sense of legal closure on this matter. Well, this chapter ends with Abraham moving to Hebron and building an altar there. Building an altar was customary to declare one's God, or one God's authority over that territory. That's what Abraham was doing. He says, this territory belongs to Jehovah, God of Israel. We'll move on to Genesis 14 next time. Would you please rise?
Yeshua.